All right, we're ready to start the afternoon session. It's my great pleasure to introduce my great friend and amazing researcher, Katerina Fragkiadaki. She's an assistant professor in the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon University. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and was a postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley and also at Google Research. Her work is on learning visual representations with little supervision and on combining spatial reasoning in deep visual learning. Her group develops algorithms for mobile computer vision, learning of physics and common sense for agents that move around and interact with the world. And her work has received a multitude of awards. So without further ado, Katerina Fragkiadaki.
Great, thank you. Thanks for organizing the workshop. Thank you for inviting me, and I really have enjoyed the previous talks. This talk is complementary to previous talks. We're not going to talk about how we're going to transfer weights between tasks. Two main themes we're going to discuss. One is 3D neural bottlenecks and reconstruction feedback with modular representations. So the world is three-dimensional and then is projected into two-dimensional images. So we all know that. And the question is, can we use this 3D, this prior that the world is in 3 dimension to learn with fewer examples? So here is how we since 2019, we've proposed some architectures in my lab that essentially equip neural networks that take images as input with what you see here, a 3-dimensional bottleneck that has 3 spatial dimensions, X, Y, Z, and 1 feature dimension. And the feature dimension is not shown here, it's shown as color. Imagine we took the channel and then we did PCA, and then we keep only the 3 principal components, and then we colorize it. So this is what this means. So this 3D neural bottleneck, you can imagine as being the featurization of the scene behind the image. Okay, so an image comes in, and then at the output of the network, you have this 3D feature map of the scene. If we don't do that, the standard thing in computer vision is we build features directly on top of image pixels, right? So we take the image, and whatever is visible, we featurize it, and we label it and predict and so on. Now, but there are these configurations. So you and me understand that there's a cat, and in front of it, there is a fence, right? So we are able to do this spatial reasoning. The question is, how can we help our networks to also do similar reasoning? What architectural biases we need to add such that this reasoning emerges when we train our networks under some hopefully self-supervised task? So this is our choice. Our choice is, what if we don't put features on the image itself? Because the image is just a noisy, incomplete 2D observation of a complete 3D reality. What if instead the features sit in that 3D scene? Okay, and here in this particular instantiation of networks, I'm going to talk about this featurization is explicit, okay, and is this 3-dimensional feature map. So here's how it looks like. You just need to design this 3-dimensional placeholder. You design its dimensions, okay, and then you can have cameras, all right, that look at the scene from different viewpoints. And these cameras can look at the scene concurrently, or it can just be one camera that, you know, moves around in time and collects observations. And these observations are now fused in that 3D feature volume, okay? Essentially, there is a non-projection operation that is parameter free that shoots and scatters those 2D features into 3 dimensions, and then the later featurization is directly on the 3 dimensions. This space is very convenient for redecorating and fusing information, because in the 2D image space, as you move your camera around, some things appear and some other things disappear, right? So you don't have permanence of the content. But in that 3D feature map behind the image, things can persist over time, all right? So you can be moving views and adding features to that 3D feature volume. Yes, and if you have some depth sensors, you can fuse that too. You have an explicit ready metric information. You can use it during your unprojection operation to place features in the right location as given by your depth sensor, for example. And then instead of having 2D CNNs or 2D transformers operating in images, we're going to have the same layers operating in these 3 dimensions. So what can you do with those architectures? Well, you can do exactly the same thing that you do for CNNs. Okay, you can train them supervised for downstream tasks. For example, you say, I want to detect now the objects that are in the scene. All right, so I have a video as input, and the output will be 3D bounding boxes, and you can train those networks supervised with such a detection annotations or segmentation annotations. Or you can train them self-supervised. And this is something that we have found with those networks. You can train them for view prediction. For example, you have seen K images, you fuse their information in the 3D feature volume, and then you give me a new viewpoint and you ask me, how would the work look if I move to that viewpoint? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to orient my tensor, my 3D feature tensor, and neurally render it with some combination of geometric and neural operations. And then I'll give you an image as the output of that. And the important thing here is that all operations are differentiable and end-to-end backprobable. So you have your end task, and the end task directly trains essentially the weights of that network and instantiates those 3-dimensional features. So you never need to supervise the 3D bottleneck directly. So the 3D bottleneck is supposed to save whatever is needed for the downstream task. Okay, so this is very different than let's say having explicit point cloud and supervising their occupancy and so on. So how does this prediction look like, the view prediction? You have a number of views, or you can have a single view. And then there's the encoder that does this 2D to 3D projection and 3D featurization. And then there is the neural renderer that orients the feature and generates an image. And then there is the pixel matching between the rendered image and the actual view, all right? And this is a self-supervised task because you just need to be an embodied agent that moves in a scene to be able to see a scene from multiple views. And the assumption here is that the scene is static. The only thing that is moving is the camera, okay? But most of the world is static, to be honest, right? But like very few things move in the world, like animals and people and maybe vehicles now that the last 100 years we've constructed, but most of the world is static and you can train from that signal. Yeah, and if you train it in this way, so essentially what happens is that the network learns to imagine, because one image is a very incomplete observation of that 3D feature volume, all right? So after projection, a very small part of those voxels sitting here are occupied, but once you train the network learns to complete and in paint the missing 3D information so that it can render different viewpoints, okay? And now your one question for those people that like geometry, right? And know about NURBS, that are implicit representations of multi-view spaces. The difference is as follows. In those geometric networks, we call them geometry-aware networks, we put the 3D bottleneck for the sake of doing better representation learning better correspondable features and so on. Rendering beautiful images is actually not important. In fact, I'm going to show you now next what we did, where we rendered not images, but rather feature maps. So we did contrastive prediction, and the features you learn out of this are better than just rendering pixels directly. The most important difference, though, is the representation itself. Geometry-aware networks, what I just showed you, have the convolutional inductive bias. They never go through a bottleneck of one vector, okay? So the representation is keeps its spatial organization, and because you have this locality of computation, actually you can generalize much better than collapsing one scene into one vector. And I'm going to show you results of that. And of course, the whole point of those representations on the left is generalization. You want to be able to train on some training scenes, and then you dump your architecture on a test scene, and you want to be able to do well. And here is what I mean by generalization. View prediction is not a new task. Previous architectures have tried view prediction. So the question is how, representations that don't go through such an explicit 3-dimensional bottleneck do on view prediction versus our architecture. And here I'm comparing with a model from DeepMind, GQN, Generative Query Network, but similar representations, similar going through a bottleneck of one vector over 2D feature map is the case with NERF models that collapse a scene into one embedding, all right? So Here, both models have been trained and tested on scenes that contain two objects, all right? And both of them do well, both of them. Now you trained it, now it's a test scene. So you show a new scene with two objects and you ask the model to render views from all over the viewing sphere, okay? And this is what I'm showing here. And both models do well. And now we're gonna take both models and test them on scenes with more objects, okay? So we have a clear, big generalization gap between trained distribution and test distribution. So here are the scenes with more objects. And what you see is that GRNN, geometry aware network, okay, is able to see 4 objects. It generalizes from 2 to 4, while networks that go through 1D bottleneck or 2D feature map, they cannot, they still see only 2 objects. So there is no reasonable generalization that happens there. And this is all due to convolutional inductive biases. For the same reason that CNNs are better than MLPs, geometry aware networks that preserve locality of computation are better than, models that have this one-dimensional or two-dimensional bottlenecks. So here's what we did. We took that network and went around and collected training data by having an embodied agent to look at the scene from different viewpoints, and then train the weights, and then put a supervised task of a 3D object detection, and pre-training for predicting images helps, as opposed to training the weights from scratch, which is not surprising. Any task, even not a good task, would help over from scratch pre-training. Now, what we saw is that the images we rendered were quite blurry, because it's very difficult to guess how the world was going to look from a different viewpoint given one image or a few images as input. So instead, what we said is, what if we give up? Rendering images is actually very good for debugging. I was able to show you those videos and say, look, we have some reasonable generalization on those toy scenes. But once you go outside of toy scenes in the simulation and you go in more realistic images, it's very hard to predict pixels, okay? Because the world is very multimodal, its appearance is very multimodal. So instead, we said, what if we just render feature maps, okay? Two-dimensional feature maps or three-dimensional feature maps. So what this accounts for is you have a set of images and you encode them into a three-dimensional feature map, and then you have your test query image here, a new viewpoint, which also you encode into a 3D feature map, and then you register both of them because you know the viewpoint, and then you say features that go to corresponding IJK grid locations should be close in embedding distance, and features that sit on different locations essentially should be far, okay? So here I showed better because I have already warped my tensor, and as you see, the two 3D feature maps are aligned. So this is standard contrastive learning done voxel-wise. And this picture shows that our encoding is just a single image, but the encoding can use one or more of those images. And then if you do that, then you take your 3D feature map and you put a camera and you render the features. They look like that. So I essentially visualize the following thing. I put a bird's eye view, slice the 3D feature map, did PCA on the feature vectors and map them to colors. And I showed them, and you see that cars are put together in the background is put in a different color and so on. And actually, this is a better pre-training task, okay? So the yellow curve is higher than the green. Essentially, contrastive prediction is better than image prediction directly on the pixel space, predicting image directly on the pixel space. So now your question would be, we know that geometry can drive self-supervised learning. Here is a simple task. And for example, in dense object nets, right? That was best paper in a Coral a few years ago. You would take a scene, you would take two different viewpoints, you know the calibration of the cameras, you know the extrinsics, and you know when two pixels in two different views correspond are projections of the same 3D physical point. So these would be your positive pairs. And you say, make sure the features of those pixels are close in embedding distance and pixels of our projections of different 3D physical points are far. And the same thing was done in 2.5D space from point contrast, right? A paper where it used a point cloud, and it featurized the point cloud that said, points, the same point projected in different views. The projection should have features that are close in embedding distance, while projections that correspond to different 3D physical points should have different features, okay? The difference between those frameworks and our framework is that we don't featurize the image, which means the pixels in the image, or we don't featurize the visible points in the 3D point cloud. We featurize even parts of the scene that are actually not visible, okay? So the imagination space also has features. And these features are contrastively matched, which means that you don't need to see the same thing from both viewpoints to actually try to featurize it. So indeed, you featurize beyond your observations. You really have an imagination space that you want to place features on, all right? In the same way that I see you now and I can imagine roughly how your backs are going to look like, and I can generate positive and negative examples for the back image and figure out when I'm surprised and when I'm not. And here is now a follow-up work on these representations. We call it coconuts from continuous contrastive 3D representations. So far, we've discussed about that three-dimensional feature map. And the problem with the feature grids that we don't like is the fact that they have we have problems with spatial resolution, right? They really occupy a lot of GPU memory, so you cannot arbitrarily scale them. So now you can take those features and parameterize implicit functions, okay? And these implicit functions, you can query them for XYZ coordinates, okay? And you can train them so that they generate the features in these essentially continuous locations. And in this way, of course, the hope of those implicit functions are that they're going to do much better trilinear interpolation because it's a trained trilinear interpolation. So the question here is not implicit functions or not implicit functions. The question is, how do we build a feature representation that is actually modular, okay? And the modularity here comes simply from locality of computation. Different parts of states have their own features that have been computed convolutionally for parts of the images that actually correspond to that part of the scene, if that makes sense. And indeed, these networks, coconuts, that both use an imagination space and are able to scale up the resolution outperform, of course, dense object nets, which is, don't even have a depth map, but also point contrast that has access to a depth sensor, same as this approach. And, for more details, you can look at the paper if you like. So here is the question. So we try to go from images directly to 3D feature maps to try to in-paint and a-modally complete essentially the observations. But the question is, does a model completion, is my ability for me to complete the scene come before or after I recognize the content of the scene, okay? So far, we showed the convolutional architecture to get there. And now I want to discuss some more entity-centric architectures that reason at the entity level for doing the similar decomposition plus in-painting of the input. So in the 3D neural mapping with geometry-aware networks, we first a-modally complete the scene, right? So we first go from 2D to a 3D feature map, and then we run on object detectors. So now what we'll discuss next is such completion will jointly happen with recognition, understanding what the entities are. I am able to complete how you look like because I know that you're human beings, okay? Now, probably this needs to happen in multiple layers in the network, but we'll see one example of this. So we heard in previous talks about transformers, and indeed they are incredible. And I really liked that intuition that the reason they're incredible is that they jointly essentially segment and featurize the input. So what we did here is we grabbed some point clouds from PartNet and we trained a 3D point cloud transformer architecture similar to DETR, with a DETR head, with a detection transformer head, with object queries that essentially segment different parts. So we trained this from chairs, okay? And you see that the detector is doing a good job on segmenting chairs into parts when, the training data are within the training distribution. But here's some crazy shapes that do not look like chairs. They don't look like chairs. However, they share parts with chairs, right? So they have, elongated edges, and they have, round spheres. I mean, if you look at their parts, in part level, they do like the parts of a chair, okay? But the thing is, the detector cannot actually rearrange those parts. That's the problem. And you go a little bit, maybe here I want to say that you go much outside the training distribution and your detector fails, all right? And humans have a remarkable ability to really generalize outside their training distribution. And when I realized this, the first time I realized this, because I always thought, okay, we just need more data, it's trivial, it's very simple. If you look the books for infants that are very, very young perceivers, right? They're pretty young. They have crazy things, like monsters with many mouths, or monsters with many eyes and 3 hands, and some other crazy things. For example, sponges washing cars, things that I have difficulty understanding, and they're designed for infants, and infants actually get them, which is, I think, incredible. So the question is, what do the infants have? And this is, by the way, a conjecture. The question is, do we just need more training data with the current architectures, or we need to also advance our model architectures? That's the question where we're going here. So this is the visual cortex. And we have some information of how it works. And it turns out that it has a lot of top-down pathways, right? A lot of priors are encoded on those top-down pathways. While our detectors, right, state-of-the-art detectors are feed-forward in nature. And we may say that, if you stack a lot of layers, essentially you can imitate a sequential computation and iterative computation just by stacking more layers. But it might be that that may this not be enough. Right now, all our priors are encoded on the weights of the network, and we hope that if feed-forward pass through that network will be able to parse the scene. There are a lot of very interesting papers that talk the importance of top-down actually pathways for recognition. Now, detectors don't have top-down pathways. They don't try to render back things that they have recognized, right? But there are many generative models developed recently, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but there is, for example, slot attention and Monet or some capsule autoencoders that try to recognize entities in the scene. And their main, essentially, supervision comes from reconstruction. They take an image, they encode it into different entities, they render back their entities, they match the pixels, and they backpropagate, and they hope that in this way they'll be able to segment the image into parts. And okay, so the encoding part is similar to our detectors, right? It's just you go from pixels, you to featurize your pixels, and then you go into these object queries. But there is also this rendering extra module where you try to reconstruct your input and have this additional reconstruction loss. And it turns out that for simple scenes, it works. This is a clever scene. But a little bit more difficult scenes, things fail. It doesn't really work. Like to auto-encode essentially single images and objects to emerge. Now, there may be some maybe things are different if you go to cross view, but let me just say that, overall things do not seem to work. So why they fail? So those completely unsupervised generative models, they try to segment a scene through reconstruction, and they try to answer 2 questions at the same time: what the objects are and where they are. So they don't have any prior about how objects are supposed to look like. They try to jointly try to figure out how those entities look like and where they are in the image. And what we propose is, what if we don't do that? There is no, right now there's a disconnect. There are detectors that are wonderful and supervised, and of course you can self-supervise them with some BYL type of contrastive objectives, but there's no reconstruction. And then we have generative models that can render images, right? But they really don't do a good job on decomposing that, okay? So can we marry these generative models and detectors together? So what we built here is something we call generating fast and slow networks. So I'll show you what this is. First, we go back to let's say Mars idea about the world is built out of parts. So it is useful to teach our network about parts. Okay. So what does this mean? This means I'm going to show point cloud parts one by one to our network. I'm going to encode them with my PointNet++ or point transformer, and I'm going to have a single slot here. One slot is one-dimensional vector, and train my network to look at this part and essentially map it into a symbol. So essentially, these are a bunch of symbols. I mean, each symbol is of course a long vector, so that's the important thing, that essentially you learn a distribution over those symbols, and then you feed the slot decoder that takes the embedding vector and renders it back into that part. So you teach your model about parts. And where are you going to find those primitive parts? Well, you can take your chairs, somebody label those chairs, but instead of showing to your network complete arrangements of those labels, you're just going to tear them apart, okay? Every part is now alone, and then I show it to the network as an entity to be recognized. So we call this encoding the primitives. So then the thing that I'm going to change is that I'm going to instantiate now multiple slots, okay? Multiple slots. So there is a combinatorial there. We changed the architecture, okay? We had here only one entity slot, and now we have multiple ones. And now for each one of them, I'm going to have a different slot decoder, okay? And then I'm going to render them and max pool them and make a chair. And you understand that if you have trained, and then I'm going to auto-encode again my network with those complete shapes, all right? Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. And let's see how this works. It kind of works. You do this auto-encoding, then you feed this point cloud, then it's kind of segments it and reconstructs it, all right? But it fails on really out of distribution examples. So this, for example, specific chair was not showing in the auto-encoding step. So what are we going to do? We're going to do slow inference. So what does slow inference mean? We're going to take a single example, a single scene, and then we're going to update our network weights via gradient descent using this reconstruction loss. So basically, we're going to optimize the weights of the network for reconstruction, and we hope that because we already know those priors about parts, that somehow segmentation will improve. And there is a very recent paper about following up on those unsupervised generative models for scene decomposition that says, look, there is no way we can optimize reconstruction at the same time segment the scene. Because the better the reconstruction, sure, you can learn to reconstruct it perfectly, but your segmentation will degenerate, okay? And they did that starting from scratch. But here we have done a curriculum. We have taught our network what are primitive parts, okay? So here is how things look like. And this slow inference, by the way, is on a single example, not on a data set for every single example. So it looks like that. The network starts and then updates its weights, and the reconstruction improves, and also the segmentation improves. And also, you don't need to predefine the number of parts. I think this is very important. Slots that are not going to be damn useful, they're going to, essentially spit out nothing. All right. So essentially, through this gradient descent, there is a search over how to decompose the scene, over primitives that I've seen before, so that the reconstruction objective improves. Okay. And this search concerns both the reconstruction of every part as well as how many parts are there. Okay. And by the way, here these tables are outside of the distribution. We only trained on chairs. And you can do that on very dissimilar shapes. You can take the same network training only on chairs and do exactly the same slow inference on laptops and lamps and anything you like. And the compositions are going to emerge. So this is the slow inference part. So we compare here with, so what I want to show in this table is that in distribution, your fast inference and slow inference are similar. Okay, your ARI. By the way, higher is better here. But outside of the distribution, look, the 3D detector, right? The fit for 3D detector really has a very small value here. Learning to group with another baseline also, has a big gap. And our model also has a big gap, but through slow inference is able to improve that performance, all right? So the slow inference really closes the gap between out of distribution shapes and in distribution shapes. Yeah, and these are some more results of generating fast and slow networks versus feed-forward detectors. And here is now we went back to the crazy shapes that we saw, and our network is able to segment them. Not using fast inference. If you feed this shape into our model, it's going to spit out something nonsense, but then you can do a slow inference and adapt its weights in each of those training examples, and essentially there's going to be a search over the decomposition. Yeah. So the question is, how do you use how do this curriculum that I just described may not be easy to do, all right, for all different setups. So here are things that we have considered. One is that you can use these generic shapes, and if you use generic shapes as opposed to chair shapes, you will do much better out of distribution. You see here you get 0.6, while before it was 0.5. All right. So the more generic your primitives, the better, as opposed to using chair parts. What we found though is that you can get decent results if you just train this model semi-supervised. For scenes that you have labels, you can just inject those labels the same way you train a detector. All right. And for scenes that you don't have labels, then you just have your reconstruction objective, and still you're going to get the benefits of slow inference. Now the sure thing, so here is the comparison between detectors and the model. For detectors, we have a Hungarian matching, right, between the predicted parts and the ground truth parts, and there's no rendering. While in our model, there is this decoder here that essentially is trying to generate back the part content. So why I like this approach? Because I think our model should be able, when they're confronted, easy scenes and difficult scenes should not be treated the same. They should not all go through the same 100 layers or 30 layers. We should be able to have a mechanism to have a compute that varies with the difficulty of the scene. And this type of slow inference can achieve that. Now, for sure, this is not the right architecture. This is not the final answer of how to do neural architecture with feedback. I mean, this is something that we're investigating, but this is just some first, let's say, attempt. And you can do similar things with images as opposed to 3D point clouds. There, the curriculum will be, instead of parts, you're going to have single object images, and you need to have two slots, one for the foreground and one for the background, and you pre-train your model, and then you instantiate more slots and you auto-encode the scenes, and you'll do much better than slot attention models or UORF and so on that uses similar object-centric biases. Okay. And here's some segmentations. And here is, again, the model can do view prediction. By the way, for the image case, I forgot to mention that we have the same cross-view prediction. One view comes in, it is decomposed, and another view is actually predicted. So there is cross-view encoder as opposed to single image. Now, just for the purpose of investigating how the model works, we also create a synthetic data set. And you see here, there is a very tiny little object, okay, visible, but the network is able to predict that, yeah, this is a separate object, and actually it can be a modally completed into that shape, right? So we do want our detectors not to label only the visible, but imagine the invisible, okay? So in this particular model, there's no explicit 3D bottleneck, but the imagination happens in a 2D space. And here you can see the slow essential inference that, as you see the model, as it's trying to minimize the reconstruction loss, it actually occasionally finds the right solution. So the right thing to do is, during your slow inference, you find when you got the smallest reconstruction error and pick that solution as your final answer, let's say, okay? And here is the adaptation on some scenes with food, okay? So these are very interesting scenes because the food occludes. One ingredient includes the other. You do want to understand that there's a cracker here, right? It's not just these visible pixels, which is what detectors do. And here, the network can understand that there are different crackers and also renders them in the right way, in the right order, to fit, the plate, let's say. All right. And by the way, rendering pixels may be a terrible idea. The right way would be to render features and do contrastive matching, the same as done previous that I described earlier. And these are things that we're looking into. But in any case, this important common sense about how objects look, how you can segment and see how can you model it completed, and these are different results. So thank you very much. That's all I have to say. These are the students that actually worked on this work. Mihir, Adam, Fish, and Shamit. Mihir worked mostly on that last part that you saw, and Adam and Fish on the earlier part. And these are the papers in case you want to, take a closer look. And I'm very happy to take your questions.
Because that mic is not connected to Zoom.
Sure. Are there any questions?
Regarding your slow pass methods, what do you think about the importance of adding the temporal domain?
Yeah. So the question is, what about videos? Because this is a workshop about videos, and you just showed images and point clouds. Yeah, that's very important. So videos are very important for supervision. For example, instead of me getting a plate full of ingredient, messy salad of fruit salad, right? I would like to observe how that salad got made. Because if I observe the process, I can have much stronger supervision about the scene decomposition. So I think supervision should happen in videos, but then once you're supervised in videos, you should be able to decompose the scene from a single image, much like all humans can. Thank you.
When it comes to the 3D feature maps, I'm curious, you showed these being used for video. So along similar lines, to what extent do these 3D feature maps learn a temporal domain or a multi-view consistency? And if so, what features enable that?
Right. So multi-view. So the question is, do these 3D feature maps handle dynamic scenes? Maybe you want to say. And also, how do they have this cross-view consistency, correct? Yeah, so I don't know if you remember on these videos that we saw with the objects and 2 and 4, you saw that they really understood multi-view consistency. And the same videos, pretty similar views you can get with a single image. So you feed the object a single image, then this object, instantiates its feature map, then you neurally render it, and you see these beautiful videos that indeed make sense. That's how the world must have been, right? So for sure, cross-view consistency emerges because you supervise for that. You say at training time, make sure you give me this image when I put my camera this way, right? So for sure, cross-view consistency emerges. Does this make sense?
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, sure.
It was very interesting. My question is that it seems that for doing these 3D representations are very useful for all the generalization, and they also seem to be very data efficient. And one of the problems that we have right now with these big transformers, for instance, is that we need a lot of 3D data. So do you think that it would be possible to export what you have now in the 3D domain to the domain? And I guess that's related to his question about do you think that maybe with video it would be possible to obtain multiple points of view, or you think that 3D vision is necessary? Like humans have 3D vision, for instance.
Yeah, so I think the question is, what do you think between the two things, which is the way forward? Great question. So the truth is that I'm not sure. That's why we develop both of them in parallel. Now, the truth is those 3D feature maps, they're features, but the map is metric, okay? And it uses calibration and so on to be built. And for sure, humans don't have 3D feature maps. So the way I think about how this 3D and spatial representation should be obtained is still we scatter the 2D features in the 3D space and we just observe them by rendering, and you just leave those features as a cloud of feature points without really needing to instantiate them in explicit 3D metric grid, for sure not. And the scene transformers have showed a little bit how to do that, okay? Now the other thing is 3D the answer to low shot image recognition? Maybe this is your question. Yeah, I mean, people have showed that if you have depth channel, right, and you ask your model to render depth and so on, maybe you'll be able to get rid of the, let's say, appearance or texture information that can be misleading or can dramatically change from train to test, correct? Yeah, so from that respect, yes, I would imagine that it will really help us to learn more shape relevant features as opposed to texture relevant features.
Do you have any understanding of how the downstream tasks affect the 3D feature representation? So whether you're trained for rendering consistency or whether you're trained for object detection, does that change the 3D feature representation? And if so, how?
Yeah, great question. So so the question is how the downstream task changes the 3D features, or the 3D features stay the same independent of the task. So let me give you a concrete answer. We use these 3D feature representations for manipulation in our latest Coral 2021 paper. And we had one feature representation for grasping. And essentially you would look at the features of the object and you would select which policy to use to grasp it. So the plate, you really had to go low, and for cup, you had to go high and so on. And what we found is that you needed very different features to select grasping versus to select how to push the object, okay? So you need to pay attention to very different details. So there are some features that you learn to be able to reconstruct the world and every little pixel, but it turns out this is not what the brain does. They say even when we render, we don't render all the way down to pixels. We render up to some mid level. And somehow we are really able to adapt the feature representation for the task. And I think this may be relevant to some in-context learning that Hugo was talking about. And these are things that we're trying to work on. How can you allow in the same model to be really use extremely different feature representations depending on the downstream task? But yeah, basically we found that we cannot share features across tasks, or that you really had to fine tune. It's not like a golden 3D feature representation that will enable everything. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Katerina.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.